This is GM Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching a battle of titans, Jan Nepomniachtchi against Hikaru Nakamura at the 2014 World Blitz Championship, and a French defense by Hikaru Nakamura, not afraid to go to a very dangerous opening against Nepomniachtchi. And we have a main line, a classical variation with knight f6. It's Hikaru trying to remember the theory and looking up at his opponent. And did he betray a little smile there? Not sure what that was all about. And knight c6 here is the main move, but not the only move, and Hikaru does play knight c6 as the bishop comes out to e3. White has built up that monster center, as is so typical in this variation of the French, and the move rook b8 by Hikaru, as he does not mince words. He is trying to expand on the queen side with b7, b5, and the big question in this position is which way is Jan going to castle? And with his last move, knight c3 to d1, he withdraws his knight back towards safety and takes the sting out of Black's further queenside expansion. And the players, they're looking at each other with violent intentions in their eyes. Both players playing for a win early on, and Hikaru shoves his f7 pawn up to f5, and he's trying to dry up, lock up the king side, and make it as difficult as possible for White to attack on the king side. So this is a clear example of opposite side attacking. Black is expanding on the queen side and getting his pawn up to b5 and c5 and d5, and normally in these positions, White tries to break through on the king side, and Jan making a very committal decision, taking en passant, trying to keep the king side as open as possible. And which way is Hikaru going to recapture? Knight takes f6 is tempting, trying to get this knight up to e4, but knight takes f6 does take the eye off of the c5 pawn. So queen takes f6, even g takes f6. All three candidate moves are very much in play, and Hikaru taking the first serious think of the game as he drops down now to 2 minutes and 15 seconds. And which way is he going to recapture on f6? What a complicated position we have here. And he does take with the knight. So he allows Nepo to take on c5, but instead, Jan continuing to maneuver his knight and moving it to f2 in order to keep the e4 square under control and keep the knight on f6 at bay. And he's got that e5 square as he ensconces his knight on this huge outpost. I like Jan's position, but Hikaru, he seems to be okay with how it's going, and he moves the knight back to e7, and there's that kingside expansion as Jan pushing his g-pawn up to g4, and he's not afraid to weaken his own king, because the only area where White can seriously consider attacking is the kingside, and Hikaru castles kingside, trying to get his rook on f8 as active as possible. And of course, that French bishop on c8, that bishop is not happy. It's totally hemmed in by his own pawns. But Hikaru with a big space advantage on the queen side, and will he continue attacking there by pushing his A pawn and then maybe his B pawn? And there he goes. He goes b5, b4, trying to open the B file and mix things up. And let's see how Jan improves his position as he moves his light-squared bishop back to d1, and I think he's moving it towards c2 in order to get as many of those light squares under his control as possible. And eventually, I'm getting worried about the safety of Black's king, and you can see that knight on e5 is an absolute monster, and Hikaru certainly cannot afford to capture that knight and give up his dark squared bishop, and Jan instantly completing his maneuver by putting the bishop on c2. Hikaru has expanded on the queen side, and now he moves his queen from d8 to e8, maybe avoiding various fork ideas that Jan would have had with knight e5 to c6. And Nepomniachtchi brings his rook into the game. Look how pretty White's central pieces are arranged. And Hikaru a4, that was actually the idea of queen e8. And what a great job by Hikaru to mix things up and create counterplay on the queen side. And now he actually threatens to push his pawn from a4 to a3 and completely destroy White's central pawn chain. If he plays a3 and Jan takes that pawn on a3, then Hikaru will take the pawn on c3 and create for himself a protected passer on c4. So a lot for Jan to think about here. Is he regretting his choice to move the rook from a1 to e1? Otherwise, he would have had to move a2, a3. And instead, Jan decides to solidify his kingside position with h2, h3, taking the g4 pawn under control and overprotecting it. And will Hikaru continue with his furious queenside pawn expansion? Will he play a3? Will he play b3? Trying to hem that light squared bishop in and force it back to b1. And the time situation starting to get a little bit concerning here as Hikaru is down 20 seconds on the clock. And finally, he decides to get his light squared bishop out of the gates and position it on a6. And can he activate that bishop? Can he try to get it through the pawns that he has? That he goes a3 and he blasts through on the queen side. And I love what Hikaru is doing here. He takes on c3. And in the meantime, Jan, he seems increasingly concerned. He hasn't managed to get anything going on the king side. All of his pieces look so nice, but can he actually break through Black's incredibly, surprisingly solid construction? And finally, Jan starts the attack and he plays g5. That queen on e8 is such a hero as it supports the knight as it moves to h5. And the knight from h5 threatens to jump into g3 and trap the rook on f1. It's also attacking the pawn on f4. And how does Jan keep everything under control? The f5 square is yet another hole that White has to deal with. The other knight could jump to f5. And things have definitely taken a turn for the worse for Jan, but he takes on h7. What an idea! King takes h7. He's going to play g6 check and force Hikaru to give up both of his knights in order to avoid getting checkmated. Hikaru blundered in and he shakes his head, and this changes the landscape of the position completely. And can Hikaru find anything? If king h8, then the bishop would have dropped back to g6, and he has nothing better than to take that bishop. But how is Hikaru going to defend against checkmate? If he moves his king back, then Jan is going to take on h5, and there he goes, and he threatens king h7, but rook f5 by Hikaru, and he somehow keeps his king alive. Queen h7, king f8, and queen h8 is not checkmate. The knight from e7, what a heroic defensive piece. It'll move back to g8 and keep the queen at bay. And there's no clear continuation of the attack as Jan sends his reserves in. Knight f2 to g4, but here's Hikaru's knight as it drops back to g8. And somehow Hikaru has managed to not only keep his king alive, but it seems like Jan's attack has reached a standstill. His knights, as nice as they appear, they don't have access to any good squares, and Jan moves his bishop back to f2, and suddenly he is the one down to 30 seconds on the clock. But Hikaru, he needs to keep things going on the queen side. He has no time to waste. Will he push his c-pawn? Yes, he does. There he goes, and he pushes c2. Jan drops his knight back to e3. That is why he vacated that square, attacking the rook on f5, and Hikaru counterattacking the rook on f1, and finally, Hikaru's light-scored bishop gets active. And knight takes f5, e takes f5. Now that rook on f1 is trapped as Hikaru grabs a queen, anticipating that a time scramble is on the cards, and Jan is down to 20 seconds. He's got the potential for a discovered attack against Black's queen. But the problem is that if Hikaru eliminates both of his rooks, he might even want to sacrifice that queen. How is Jan going to stop the c2 pawn? And he drops the knight back to c4. What a creative move, intercepting the bishop and attacking the queen on e8, and Hikaru has to move it, and he moves it to d7. But 10 seconds for Jan Nepomniachtchi, and two monster passed pawns that he has to deal with as he takes on d6. And can Hikaru take the rook? He does. Look at that queen on h7. It's been stranded there for the past 20 moves. Amazing that Hikaru managed to avoid getting checkmated. And Jan, with his last seconds, he takes on f1, but there's rook b1. Bishop to e3. Jan continuing to stop the c-pawns, but Hikaru simply takes on d6, and Jan's pawns are so much slower. Can Hikaru find a way to dislodge the bishop on e3 and eliminate the last line of defense? What a move. Queen e6. He's going to give the queen up for the bishop, and he's going to promote his pawn, and he's going to win the game, and Jan is in disbelief. King f3, and he looks up at his opponent. What an incredible defensive effort. Hikaru turns it around and wins. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these videos. Thank you so much for watching.